Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Cameron. I'm a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, California, where I prosecute cybercrime. And this is Elliott, who's an FBI agent in Anchorage, Alaska, and he works on a cyber and counterintelligence squad there. We are obviously climatically very different people, as you can see from our slide. But we've worked together for years on a project that we'd like to talk to you guys about today. And specifically, we're here to talk about DDoS and a series of investigations into what are called booter or stressor services. You guys may be familiar with them. They're basically DDoS for hire services. And we're going to talk about how our approach has evolved from thinking about individual criminal services to targeting an entire criminal ecosystem. Along the way, we hope you'll learn about how this ecosystem works, how it may affect you and your organization, and what the future of these large-scale investigations looks like. So there are two of us up here on stage, but really we are a very small part of a huge team, including other DOJ attorneys in other parts of the country, other FBI agents, law enforcement officers from all over the world, and some of the best minds in private industry, and even some academics who study these particular problems. Not everyone who helps and works with us is on this slide for various reasons, but everyone is appreciated and is a key part of our team. Everything described in this presentation is a team effort. And if you like team efforts and you don't like cybercrime, then we'd love to work with you on this or any number of other cyber threats. So this is a roadmap of where we're going today. Elliott is going to discuss some basic DDoS terminology and talk about what DDoS services look like today. But we're going to be focusing on these things called booters. Then we're going to take you into kind of a behind-the-scenes look at a series of investigations we've done starting in 2018. That part of our investigation was then followed up by some really interesting academic research, which we took and used to inform our next actions, including in Christmas of 2022 and the months following. In fact, we're still investigating and working on this problem, and we'll talk about some of the really interesting things that we've learned along the way and that we think you can also apply to your work, and then finally we'll try to leave some time for questions at the end. I'm going to turn it over to Elliott to talk about DDoS.
Thank you, Cameron. So currently today, we track three main types of DDoS for hire services. Booter or stressors, which you're going to hear the most about today. Botnet-based services, so you may have heard of botnets like Mirai or Qbot or Satori, very prolific DDoS sources, not what we're going to get in the weeds on today. And then probably in about the past year, we've seen a rise in what we call open proxy services. So these are DDoS services that are essentially obfuscating their attack architecture through open proxy resolvers, so that what the victim would see are the IPs of the resolvers and not the source IPs for the attack. And that has been a pretty growing trend. Hopefully we'll be back in a future year to talk to you about. So to conceptualize what a booter service is and how it sort of fits within these three, it's cheaper. They generally cost about $30 a month. They are using UDP amplification-based attacks. They usually describe them as layer 3, layer 4. This might mean that they are using amplified DNS, SSDP, or one of those other, often older UDP-based protocols. When you move to botnets, we often see the price increase significantly. And we have access to botnets. We've interviewed quite a few people that have run them over the years. And prices start at the cheap side at often around $300 a month and sometimes much higher. Usually botnets are exclusively TCP-based attack methods. That's what some of their strength come from, is the ability to do TCP at such volume. Now, one of the questions Cameron and I get all the time is, why are people conducting DDoS attacks? Especially, why are they doing it if they know that it's illegal? So extortion is a big piece of what we see these attacks used for. If I can shut down your website, a specific web service, if I can keep you from being able to access internet from home, I might be able to get money from you to stop doing those attacks. And so we do see groups that focus quite a bit on extortion. Probably still the #1 source of motivation for DDoS attacks is people seeking to gain a competitive advantage in gaming. And so if you're in any way exposed to any part of the gaming industry, you're probably very familiar with DDoS. But we actually see some of those same techniques applied within commerce, less commonly in America, in Western Europe, but there are countries for which we see extensive use of DDoS to try to shut down maybe a competing business segment and draw their customers maybe over to the person launching the attack. So that can be a good attacker motivation to sometimes think through depending on what type of attack your corporation's dealing with. We also see retaliation or nuisance type attacks. And finally, we see a fair number of what we describe as geopolitical attacks. So these could be attacks that are conducted by a group associated with a country, by a country. We've seen a fair of that play out, and that certainly escalated quite a bit 2021, 2022. We've seen a fair amount of that. And a really interesting piece of DDoS is that it can actually be generally measured pretty well, measured, quantified, counted, in contrast to a lot of crime types. And what that's allowed Cameron and I to do today is show you some information suggesting how good or how bad we're actually doing at our jobs. So we're going to share that with you. Let's jump into what some of these services look like. So this is the web page for a DDoS service. Sometimes they go to great pains to make it look quasi-legitimate. Sometimes they don't. So in the case of this one, you might see some references if you poke around to stress testing, network stress testing. And one of the ways we like to explain are these services viable or not. If you wanted to test your network, you probably would not go to the bowels of the internet and give somebody Bitcoin. Probably. But that's essentially how all of these services work. Now, this one actually has a pretty good description of what it does. Cheap DDoS for hire tool. And let's go inside and see if that's the case. And so once you create an account and log in on almost all of these services, you'll be greeted with essentially a menu. And you're going to see prices, generally starting cheapest to highest. This is not all of the services offered here that keeps going. A lot of them might have 10, even 15 tiers, depending on the different attack pieces you want to put together, which I'll explain. So in this case, we're going to look at the cheapest plan, which is their $20 plan. And for $20, you get 1,000 seconds of attack, one target at a time. You get access to layer 4 and layer 7 methods. And these variables are the variables that all of these services play with. Maybe I want more what they call concurrence. I want to be able to attack 2 or 3 or 4 victims at a time. I'll pay extra for that. Maybe I need my attacks to run longer. I'll pay extra for that. Maybe I need API access because I'm going to build this into another criminal tool I run. You're going to pay extra for that. So the default currency for all of this is cryptocurrencies. Some accept sort of PayPal and credit card as a one-off, although when we identify that, we try to work with the payment vendors to shut that down. But right now, you're probably thinking $20, a lot of money. That might be your entire operating budget for the year, like it is mine. So you want to know, does this work before you spend your money? Well, a lot of them do, and that's what this page is. So then after you pay your money, you get access to their attack page, or in this case, an attack hub. All of these services have one, and I'm going to explain how simple it is to use it. And if you're maybe at home later watching this talk sometime and you're thinking that this is starting to feel a little bit like a tutorial, I'd like to remind you that what I'm showing you is probably a federal felony. So in Minecraft, you could enter an IP address, you could enter an attack duration, you could choose your method, and then you have to click send. And that is often all there is to use this to give some IT admin somewhere a very bad day. And it's this low barrier to entry and this sort of lower technical skill for the customer base that's made this a really problematic thing for us to kind of deal with and address. So that's how they work. And once we find out they work, we prioritize them for investigation. And that, for us, has become a pretty linear process. We test a service. If it works, we find out who's operating it. We go and try to visit them in person. We talk about how we have opposing values, which is a really fun conversation. And then I go back and I take all of the summary of all of that back to Cameron, a prosecutor, to see what happens next.
OK, so we've talked about what DDoS is and what goes into some of the testing and investigation that Elliott has done. I want to go back in time and talk to you about one of our first attempts at a scaled operation. So in December of 2018, we seized 15 of what were identified as the top booter services. This is the splash page that you would get to if you tried to go to one of them. And we also arrested 4 individuals who were involved in operating them. In this case, in cases out of both Los Angeles and Anchorage. And as Elliott said, there's many players in this ecosystem. We thought, let's start with the administrators, the people who are operating these sites. And he worked to identify them. We used a lot of legal process to do that. And then we brought charges. So what does that mean? First of all, it doesn't mean that the defendants were actually in Anchorage or Los Angeles. It just means that their crimes touched our districts in some way. And with this kind of cybercrime, that is almost inevitable. So to charge someone, we bring an indictment, present it to a grand jury, and if the grand jury finds that there is probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed by the person we identify, that starts this whole long process, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Seizures, like the seizures of these domains, is a little bit different. In that case, we are going to a judge to persuade the judge that the property that we're asking to seize has been involved in criminal activity. In this case, the property was the domain names of those top booter services. And our hope was that in seizing many and arresting a few, we could persuade others in this space to move on. Now, as I mentioned, we didn't do any of this alone, but we did it in conjunction with private industry and law enforcement partners worldwide, including helping us identify which of these top booter services we should focus on, which ones to seize, how to do it, what country had the capabilities to do it, et cetera. And the US ended up being kind of the leading person in the seizures and arrests at this part of our investigation. And as far as we know, this was a pretty novel approach. This hadn't been done at this scale, this deliberately, for a crime type like this. And we wanted to see what kind of effect we could have. So you may be asking, what's with Christmas? Why do we keep having Christmas up here in our slides? Well, it's historically and sort of sociologically been one of the most active DDoS periods. This relates to factors like kids are home from school or on Christmas break, holiday break. They have extra time. They may get game consoles for Christmas or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa. They may get new games. They want to try them out. They want to be online. And they get mad when other people are beating them in games, so they decide maybe they should use one of these services to gain an advantage, as Elliott talked about, in these games that they're playing. And so we tried to time our operations to coincide with what had traditionally been a ramp-up period in DDoS and see if we could be a tamp-down period instead. So, success? Well, it's complicated, and actually it's really complicated, as Elliott's going to talk to you about in a little bit. And for me and my colleague in Alaska, Adam Alexander, this was just the beginning of a long, pretty laborious process of dealing with the people who had been arrested and charged. There's discovery, there's motions, there's back and forth with defense counsel, and then there's either guilty pleas or trial. 3 of the 4 people that we charged pleaded guilty, but one of them, Matthew Cottrell, exercised his constitutional right to a trial by jury and made us try to prove up our case. This slide is a picture of the attack page for Mr. Cottrell's booter service, which was called Down Them, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner. This is like one of the slides that Elliott showed you earlier for a different service. And you may or may not be able to see, but at the top there's a running count of the number of attacks launched, which is over 200,000 in this case, and the number of users and some other stats. And at the bottom, there are what purport to be resolvers. So if you don't know the IP address of the person you were trying to attack, maybe you just know their Skype name, this purports to be able to identify that IP address for you so that you can then launch an attack. And the upper left corner, where there's something blacked out, is where Elliott put in an IP address to run his tests to see if this booter functioned. We didn't want to target those booter services that weren't actually functioning, either because they were just poorly designed or they were scams. We were looking to target the ones that actually were out there causing harm. And as you can see, maybe in that black window in the middle, is the outcome of the 2 tests that Elliott had run thus far during his testing. And the status window says, attack successful. So you may think, well, how hard can it be to do a trial with this kind of evidence? But trying a case is maybe harder than it seems, and we have a very high burden of proof. Taking this case to trial started this long process that ultimately played out in a courtroom in Los Angeles in August of 2021, with a special thank you to COVID for making that whole process take even longer. And over a couple of weeks, we had the challenge of trying to explain to a jury how the internet functions, various networking concepts, what DDoS is, and doing that through experts and with very strict rules of evidence that had cabins on what we could say and what we could introduce. So you can imagine what it's like trying to explain to your parents what you do for a living. We had to do that for 12 members of the general public. And to try and persuade them that this wasn't network stress testing, as that veneer of legitimacy that Elliott mentioned sometimes purports it to be, and that Mr. Cottrell's attacks worked and harmed the victims that were involved, and that he was, in fact, responsible for what people did with his service. So let me tell you a little bit about a jury trial. The government, in this case me and my colleague from Alaska, who kindly came down to Los Angeles to try the case with me, had to prove that the charges we levied against Mr. Cottrell, every element of those charges, meaning every component that the statute says we need to prove in order to make this a crime, we had to prove that every one of those things was true beyond a reasonable doubt. And to do that, of course, we present evidence in various forms. That may be evidence gathered by investigators, like Elliott. It could be testimony by victims or by witnesses or experts, and we had a couple of excellent experts in our case. And what you're going to see on the next two slides are actual exhibits that we used during trial. So the jury saw things like this. This is essentially a trouble ticketing system. You guys are all familiar with these sorts of systems. And in these, Mr. Cottrell advised his customers on how to best use the down them service to attack their identified victims. We have these because the FBI obtained a copy of Mr. Cottrell's entire database that was used to run the down them service. Now, you can see with this one that he agrees that he'll run a test. The customer asks him, can you try attacking this, provides an IP address, and Mr. Cottrell says, yeah, I'll do what I can. So he says, the customer says, word, thanks. I remember using your service before. It was great. And then Mr. Cottrell says, here's what I got earlier, and provides this link. Now, if you click on this link, you can see exactly what happened. This you might recognize as the background from the attack page from the down them booter service. And in the middle there, you can see he's screenshotted his screen, and he's added this ping response. And as you can see, it absolutely worked. That computer stopped responding when he attacked the IP address that he put in that left-hand corner that the customer asked him to. Customer was very satisfied. Wow, nice. But were you able to hold that off longer than 20, meaning longer than 20 seconds? And Mr. Cottrell says, honestly, I didn't even get to try. I hit it for 20 seconds, and it was off for over 5 minutes. And this is one of the things that we saw with these services. Sometimes there's a tail on these things that is far greater than even the people using them intended. And that's one of the problems we were tackling here. This is another exhibit. This is a ticket where a customer was having trouble downing his intended target, so he asked for help. Mr. Cottrell stepped in and said, oh, it's Verizon Fios from Virginia. Pretty easy to down. And what do you think that next link is? Another screenshot of the down them site with Mr. Cottrell using it and showing that, in fact, there's another proof of life, or proof of death, if you like, showing that the victim computer had, in fact, stopped being able to respond. So he's using his own booter system to show his customers that not only does it function, it sends data, but it actually is able to take computers offline and make them unable to respond to his test commands. He's providing the own proof to his customers that his system, in fact, works. And the jury saw evidence like this. Mr. Cottrell bragging that his service had downed Google, Fios, Verizon, AT&T, Canada, Russia, even Saudi Arabia in the last week alone. This is how widespread the use of his service was. This is what he, in fact, was using it for, and therefore what he was enticing his customers to be using it for. Sometimes, Mr. Cottrell and his customers would even discuss the legality of their activities amongst themselves. Here's one where one of his customers says, well, there's no law against DDoS here. It's completely legal. Heh. Mr. Cottrell says, where? It shouldn't be legal anywhere, with which we agree. The person says, well, I didn't mean it's legal, like it's allowed, of course, but it's not mentioned in any rules anywhere in my country, in Egypt. I don't know whether that's true, but he says, yeah, you got some point. Even he agrees it probably should be illegal everywhere. And Mr. Cottrell says, yeah, I know, and I'm semi-surprised. It's becoming widely illegal everywhere. Here, it's cyber terrorism if you're caught. Now, it's not cyber terrorism, I want to assure you, but it is a crime. And the trial was kind of weeks of this, of presenting this kind of evidence, having experts explain it to the jury. We had an excellent expert talk about networking systems in general and communication systems and explaining DDoS. We had an expert who focused on booter services in his own work, who was working at a university, and hoping that they could make these concepts understandable to the jury and allowing us to kind of wade through networking evidence and PCAP data and hoping the jury would understand what we were showing them and agree that Mr. Cottrell did in fact commit a crime. So we make our case. We present all our evidence, and then we wait. We pack up all our things, we go back to our office, we just have to wait while the jury deliberates. And we wait to see if we've convinced 12 people that we had in fact established our case and met that beyond a reasonable doubt burden. And it turns out they agreed that we had. So our takeaway from this is that, yes, prosecution and trial is a viable avenue for tackling these services and this crime type, but it is incredibly labor and resource intensive. The first one is always the hardest, and we learned a lot from the process, so we've definitely been more efficient going forward. But we also wanted to see what else we could do to kind of extend and amplify the effect of what we were doing to reach more than just these people. And while this had been a hard and multi-year process, we were by no means ready to quit. So we circled back up with all of our partners to reassess and to make a new plan for the next phase of our investigation, which Elliott's going to talk about.
So we're going to fast forward now. We're in January 2022, and I'm talking to law enforcement officers at different countries throughout the world, my bosses, other US entities, and we've decided that what we're going to do is more. We want to do more of everything, and we're trying to figure out how to do that.
Big green button.
Big button. But before we got too carried away with doing what we thought was better, what we thought was more, we did something really unusual, and we pulled in all the people that we knew of that cared about this problem. So we pulled in people from private sector, from academia, from international law enforcement. We put everyone in the same room, and we listened. We listened to summaries of the cases that have been done before. We listened to some of the emerging DDoS techniques that private sector was seeing. We learned from our international law enforcement partners how they were starting to communicate with the very groups that are sort of proposing and pushing all of this DDoS activity. And we listened to academics that had studied our operations, because in fact, a group of academics had gone as far as to interview some of the people we arrested, some of the people that we had seized their websites but had maybe just gone away, some of the law enforcement officers that had participated, and they looked at DDoS data before, during, and after to try to come up with a sense of like, well, what had actually happened? And all this had taken place while we were worried about trying to get together, get through this trial, get to the other side of this. So we tried to bring all of that information in. And we ended up being really blown away by two studies, which I want to briefly summarize. So the first one is called Cybercrime is Boring. And if you're in this space and you work on cybercrime issues, you really have to read it, because all of us have this narrative we tell each other where cybercriminals are successful, they're all millionaires, they're all doing, living these lavish lifestyle. And the reality is, like anything else, it's a very tiny percentage. The majority are bored and working tedious functions and can be inconvenienced. The very act of us shutting down a website hosting means they've got to go back, renew it, spend more money. It costs them money and it costs them time. And this study seems to suggest that if we can increase friction, we may be able to drive a lot of cyber criminals out of this space. What does that mean for you? Well, you need to follow through with abuse. That's a big part of it, right? Who believes abuse is effective and works? All right. We're going to pretend everyone's hands up and we're all sold. We don't do a good job of this, right? We're sort of allowing there to be good and bad corners of the internet. And this research seemed to suggest if we enforce our standards on all of the internet, things get a lot better. So one of the things we're playing with, because we do abuse ourselves, is starting to copy the peers, the upstream, maybe the registries, right? Climbing the ladder, not just notifying the bad guy, or not just notifying, let's say, the host where the abusive content is coming out, but if we know that they're not going to respond, putting their peers, putting other groups on notice, putting pressure on them has been really effective, and we'd encourage you to look at doing the same thing. All right, this next study, really fascinating. This is influence, infrastructure, and recentering cybercrime policing. And this was a study that basically analyzed everything we did in 2018 and tried to figure out how we could do a better job. And basically, there's two primary conclusions. First, that law enforcement is finally beginning to find effective methods to disrupt online criminal marketplaces. But second, that those marketplaces are very resilient in the face of traditional law enforcement techniques. So like we mentioned, complicated. So they summarize two sort of emerging forms of policing. And the first is infrastructural policing, this idea that we're actually going to also simultaneously pursue infrastructure, hosting, domains, the mechanisms of how these actors are implementing some of their cybercrime. And the second is influence policing. This idea that we're going to use our law enforcement powers and abilities to communicate directly with either the criminals themselves or people who might likely engage in cybercrime to try to divert them, to try to get them out of this space. And so this graph you're seeing at the bottom is depicting activities which broadly would probably fit in one of those two groups. And 2018 was the first time we tried to bring both of those concepts together. So that is this far right dip, probably bigger and more pronounced than any of our other operations had achieved to date. So this is what we're looking for, but there was a catch in all of this, something they described as the monopoly effect. And so buried within that success was this data. And essentially, this is a graph depicting those booter services that self-advertise their daily attack. So it gave us another way to sort of attribute activity to a specific booter. And each color is a different service. This chart's in the chart starts in 2017. And I want to point out some key timelines. This is essentially where we began our planning. How do we go after the booter market? What are the top services? This period of time is us conducting an investigation, identifying who's operating them, where are they located, do we have enough evidence to jump to the next stage, which is a search, which is where I and my friends put on our nicest clothes and we go out and we visit people. And we ask them polite questions about their activities and also what the large server rack in their bedroom is for. And then we take all of that evidence back and we go all over the country doing that. And then all of the work comes together. We announce arrests and charges. We go after domains. We go after infrastructure. We put the pressure on. But what we'd missed is that after our investigative period, one of these services had become dominant. And when we displaced all of the customers through our other takedowns, because it was a mobile and informed customer base, they moved to the other service. So we actually probably achieved less of an effect than we wanted. And so this was something we tried to file away for our next operation. So take a deep breath. We're moving forward in time to December 2022. You want to do some DDoS because you weren't paying attention. You don't realize it's a felony. You decide to go to your favorite booter website and
this is what you find. Your favorite booter website, in fact, all 49 of your favorite booter websites are gone. And you see this instead. Now, hopefully you notice that this web page looks a little bit different from our last splash page. For one, it's red. No cool blue FBI vibe this time. And the smart people that Elliott mentioned before said that red was important. Red was sort of visceral. Red was supposed to mean stop. And I admit that this is not a great looking web page. One of the media articles discussing our takedown had some critical words about the quality of our splash page and how it looked like someone had pasted a bunch of logos onto Adobe or PowerPoint, which Elliott kind of took personally because that's exactly what he did. He's not a web designer, he's an FBI agent. And of course, since it was Christmas again, the researchers had to do one with hats. But the other thing we did was add a resource page. And you can see that URL at the bottom. In fact, if you clicked anywhere on this landing page, you would be taken to a web page that explained what DDoS was, why it was illegal, what the consequences were, and what resources were available on it. That's this page. This page was visited tens of thousands of times. You could also get there by clicking one of the Google ads that the FBI was running for terms like DDoS attack and booter service. And we've received some pretty positive response to putting this kind of information out there, making it really accessible to the communities who would otherwise be engaging in this conduct, who are probably still engaging in this conduct. And all this was part of a specific operational aim to spread out the outcome of our activities over a longer time period and over a broader audience. So, for example, when we finished charging operators and seizing domains, our partners were also busy running fake booter services that looked just like the kinds of services Elliott showed you before, and then they were generating information on the people who were trying to use them. And all of us at the same time are continuing to run those Google ads that might direct you to this splash page or maybe to one of the fake booter services. And this is our initial version of what doing more looked like. The blue line represents DDoS attack volumes by month. The orange line represents DDoS attack volumes in the period of our Christmas 2022 operation. The dotted blue line is the expected monthly attack volume, and the gray line is the actual recorded volume. So the net result was maybe a 20% reduction in DDoS attack volumes. We hadn't solved the problem, but we seem to be moving in the right direction. In May of this year, we did another round of seizures and announced that 4 individuals that had been charged in December had already pleaded guilty. We were learning to be faster. And in fact, we're continuing to learn by observing the responses to our actions as well.
So none of what we're doing is happening in a vacuum. And we've mentioned a few times these DDoS supporting communities. And like a lot of cybercrime, there are entire communities that exist to promote it, to basically pair buyers and sellers in this space. And so what you're seeing here is a screenshot from one of these communities where they do exactly that. And another thing they turn out to be interested in is law enforcement operations that are targeting them. And so what we're actually seeing here is an instant recognition in May that DNS problems springing up at a bunch of booting websites was actually another seizure. And we also see that the operators had learned how to respond even more quickly, because here we see one promising their customers 2 things. They'll be back very quickly and everything is safe. And we think one of those 2 statements is probably true. Let me show you another one. We see here that some of the branding has taken hold. They're using our operational terminology, which in this case was power off, among themselves to explain things, which is pretty fascinating. But another fun piece is we didn't take down all of the websites. And so we actually see a comment here. In the paper from FBI, there is written that some booters do not work. They just exist to scam people, and they don't seize those. And that paper, by the way, is my warrant that I write to a judge explaining why we need to seize this property. And we explain that we test them. And the ones that don't work go into a bucket that we're not dealing with in the same way. And so it created a bit of instability in the marketplace, whereas if you weren't seized, is it because you were a scam? Or you not, does it not work? It was an interesting thing to play out. But we also get helpful advice, like as in this case. Why aren't we seizing hosting? Well, that is complicated, and there's international components, and it's something we want to do going forward. But even in this community themselves, the actors are pointing out someone should go to fbi.gov.tips and tell them how to seize hosting, which we thought was correct and hilarious. I am going to jump, so we have time for questions, over to take you to a very quick tour of some of the data. So when we interview these generally young men that are engaged in these criminal acts and borrow from them all of their data, it's pretty fascinating because now we can correlate DDoS attacks back to specific services and their customers. Because by the way, they have all of this data on which of their customers launched which attack. And so what you're seeing here is sort of a heat map around the world of where users are when they're launching attacks. And what you should see is a heavy North American, Western European presence. In some areas of the world, like Antarctica, not a lot of attacks. Also, a lot of parts of maybe Central Africa. And I'm going to now show you where the attacks are going to. So I showed you where they were coming from. The map hasn't changed a lot, and that's what we've sort of found in the past. A lot of North American customers are attacking things in North America. Asian customers are attacking things in Asia. That's pretty interesting to us about this crime type. Well, let's look at the top attack targets. Now, these are ASs. I know the font may be a little bit small, but I want to color code this for you. And in this case, orange is what we'd call residential, so small business homes, and blue would be more traditional sort of server hosting. And what you're going to see is for these types of services, by and large, by volume, most of the victims are going to fit in that sort of SOHO residential category. And I think that's pretty interesting. And we are going to look at where people are logging in from. This data is a little interesting and I think heavily skewed by the extensive API usage for some of these. This data, when we looked at where everyone was coming from, showed us, for example, that OVH was the top source and that Cloudflare was a very highly ranked source of customer logins. And sometimes the way these data sets are structured, we get some things. We don't think this is right. We think that the login data probably pretty much resembles the actual attack target data.
So just kind of to wrap up, we want to briefly summarize kind of the things that we learned in this whole process. Most cybercrime investigations are complex and they take a long time to conclude. And as complex as they are, we've learned that we also have to widen the aperture and investigate even more things simultaneously. The most obvious but elusive challenge is coordination among all of the partners. And we've tried to highlight the degree of planning that has been required in these operations, and it's hard to even express kind of the full scope of that and how difficult it can be when you're talking about crossing international borders and talking about crossing the border between private and public. But we think it's been incredibly successful, and we've learned a lot along the way. We've tried to highlight just how much learning and listening we've had to do, and how long it takes to build the relationships that all of this requires. Criminal service operators and the customers exist in an ecosystem together. And our view is that successful operations need to target both groups. So we'll be looking at more of this going forward. And finally, we've learned, as I hope you've taken away from this, how important it is to be critical of your past work. What did you expect to happen? What actually happened? How can you achieve better results next time?
So I talked a little bit about the abuse process again. We would encourage all of you to participate both ways, right? If you're getting abuse, run it down, tell your customer to quit, but don't give up. We think that actually a lot of this can be solved by increasing friction. We put some resources up here for you. What Cameron and I would like to do is take questions. We are fully prepared to bribe you today, so we actually have some fun government stickers for you. If you stick around and ask a question, and we'll stay after the talk, we'd like to trade you a sticker for each question. That's all we've got today.
Okay. I will just wrap up with a final thing. We just want to thank you guys so much. We understand that we cannot make the internet better on our own, and the work that you all do is actually a huge part of what makes it possible for all of us to live and thrive in modern society. We hope if you take nothing else away from this presentation, you'll take that we're here from the government and we're actually here to help. And we'd love to work with you to tackle these problems we all face together.
Thank you. Supposedly, if you have questions, all you have to do is speak up and it'll get captured.
Or come to a microphone, but there's no training
microphones.
after us, so we can hang around for a little while.
Or come to the stadium. Sir.
Like start out in investigating.
We're going to the
Sir, what's your question?
Like
So what do you?
like ICT
Yeah.
planes.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh,
What are you doing
we'll do group questions.
for the infrastructure that's behind the booters and
Yeah, a lot. Really good question. So with booters, the short answer is they're entirely dependent on networks that allow IP header modification.
Yep.
And we're working with private industry to track down and try to eliminate those sources. Great question.
yeah, because there's certain if you know what these are, you know.
Yeah, the top one we're seeing right now is Telecom Italia. If anyone in here is from Telecom Italia, come talk to me. I'd like to save you a lot of grief and have you fix your problems, but we're pursuing that. Thank you for the very informed question, Dave.
Don.
Dave, not Dave. Don, sorry. You're it. Oh, how did you know that? You get problems from them? We should talk, yeah. Please, questions.
My question would be, originally I come from a country that I saw was attacked by DDoS last week.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I see them struggling with is not only the technical capability, but the legal capability.
Yes.
What are the areas of collaboration that you see with some of these countries? Are there plans to reach out to them and say, hey, we are not at least in step 1, we're in step 5, you're in step 0.
Great question.
This is how we can help you.
We have been working predominantly right now with Europol to do exactly that, but it's mostly been Europe. If you have contacts, push them to us. Every country is sort of dealing with how to respond to DDoS. A lot of what we think we've learned, we're trying to share as much as we can. Great question.
Yeah, and just to make it this complicated, this is actually in Africa. So you can imagine they are still in the very infant stages. But
we'd still love to talk to them and help. Yeah.
Alrighty, thank you.
Yeah, please. Thank you so much.
Just curious, what are the defense teams try to say their clients are doing?
Oh, that's such a great question. Cameron, do you want to answer that?
Definitely answer that. So there's a couple of different avenues that they take. One is, this was legitimate network stress testing, as Elliott suggested at the beginning. There's some veneer of that you see on these services that say, obviously only use this to attack your own infrastructure, which is clearly not what anybody does with it, but there's some language, and there's some language sometimes that says, you can't use my service to do anything illegal. Now, the service is designed to only do illegal things, so the terms of service don't really, we think, insulate anybody from that. But that's one of the things, and there was kind of this myth in the subculture for a while that one of these services had successfully been operating legally for years, and it was one of the biggest and longest running and most profitable services.
And we just charged him to shut all that down. So.
But there's kind of a myth, and these myths kind of circulate.
But all the operators at the end of the day were also, just like you saw, they could not help but use their service when they were mad, when they had a grievance, to sell. So all of that fell away because we can always show the operator themselves as using it. And they all would end up having conversations like that. They're like, yeah, it's illegal, but we're going to say X. But it took us a while to have, I think, the confidence on our own to challenge them on all of this. So really great question.
Hi. So a couple of organizations, both in the industry and government space, have experienced DNS flood attacks, or what is now being called as DNS laundering, from attackers who are leveraging public recursive DNS services from big companies like Cloudflare and Google that just have endless space that can be leveraged to attack even government entities that can't really defend against it effectively without it causing collateral damage to their user base. Has the FBI had any experience with that, and is there any progress in being able to work with the kind of downstream providers like Cloudflare and Google to help mitigate that?
We work with them constantly. So we haven't, this talk is really trying to confine it to the booter space. We work botnet investigations, we work all of this other stuff. The DNS water torture, which is I think what you're describing now, that's not something that I've specifically targeted. If we saw it incorporated into booting services, we'd probably lump that together, but it is something we're sort of watching as it develops. Just like the proxy-based architecture, these open proxies, that's something we're monitoring because it's becoming so problematic. So great question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Benjamin.
So where is the line drawn between the legality of these services? For instance, if I do want to stress test my own hardware,
there are a million ways for you to do that. It just wouldn't involve abusing DNS resources or UDP across the internet. So most of the companies that do this for a living, they'll park equipment on your network, or they'll get hold harmlesses across whatever sort of span it is between them and you. We don't know of anybody that does this remotely in a way that you're just going to push gigabits across the internet, because the other thing we didn't really get into is often people are victimized on the path to the victim, if that makes sense. Some of these attacks are so big that we've seen entire neighborhoods knocked offline, or en route to the victim, you're filling switches up. So there are plenty of legitimate ways to do this, but none of these services are doing it that way. Great question. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I have a slightly different question. I'm interested in how is the venue set in the cybercrimes that you are prosecuting, and if you can benefit from specialization in this case, or maybe from trying the cases in, let's say, urban areas. Is it easier to convince the court and jurors during the proceedings?
Interesting. I hadn't thought about it as being whether it would be easier to convince people in one location or another. I think venue in cybercrimes is interesting. It's a really good question because services like this will have customers everywhere, will have victims everywhere. So there's a fair amount of flexibility. We don't forum shop in the sense of like, I think this is a good court, so I want to bring a case there. It's more, where do we have the resources to go after this crime type, and has it touched that area in some way? US cybercrime laws are fairly broad in terms of where we can cite things and whether parts of it can take place outside of the United States and still be prosecutable here. So it's mostly a question of where do we have the resources to do it, rather than sort of seeking out a particular venue. Great question.
For example, I test often against servers in LA, and that's what we often describe as sort of our initial foray into venue. And then when we get the attack logs, there's tons of customers and victims in LA, and then we didn't need that previous work, if that makes sense. Because what you're picking up on is Cameron and I are very focused on this problem in a way maybe other places aren't. So there tend to be a lot of Alaska and LA prosecutions of DDoS matters. Really great question, sir.
So some of the DDoS prevention and mitigation tools that we utilize have identified some of known violator data centers. Is there going to be more bigger push on putting more responsibility on the cloud providers?
That's a fantastic question. We are working on that. We don't look at it, we're trying not to look at it as a criminal issue, and we're trying to work with other hosting companies and other people to clean that up. So believe it or not thanks to us, but thanks to people in private industry, the number of places for which you can cause abuse through IP header modification has shrunk by probably 90% over the last year or two because of diligent, hard work by people at Amazon and other places to actually trace these attacks and hold the companies sourcing them responsible. There's only a little bit more work to go, and then this problem may end up solving itself, and we're going to have to work on the next thing they come up with, the next attack technique. So great question. If you want to help with that, email me, and I'd be happy to put you in contact with other people that are doing that. Great question. Thank you. Yeah.
All right, this isn't so much of a question, but I used to work for a managed hosting provider, and I mean, we got hit by DDoS a couple times a year, Christmas, almost always. But I will say, I've always submitted, forensic reports as best as I could to the FBI, and I've never once received a response.
I'm sorry, you probably sent it like we tell you to IC3, and we didn't see it. We're a very small operation.
You guys got to get an auto response going at least.
Yeah, I agree. Like I said, I've actually talked to them about that because I 100% agree, particularly because some people will rely on that and then not take other actions. Not so much in this space, but in other spaces where data's ephemeral and money is flowing, and they're not sure if they're supposed to be doing something else. So I agree, that's something we've been looking at, and it is. I mean, for what it's worth, we do go back and look at that data when we start investigating something. We try to pull from IC3 where there have been other incidents and try to aggregate that data. So it's not that it doesn't go anywhere, it does go somewhere, but we're really bad on the response part, I agree.
And thanks for doing that. It's so important to do the reporting. Yeah, of course, Zach, thank you.
I mean, a little bit further back from just denial of service, but organized cybercrime, the idea of making it more difficult for attackers, are you finding that that is as successful against the nation-state sponsored actors, or is it just something that works against?
I wish we had 10 minutes. Yes. I think most of the time I'd still say yes, understanding that if somebody's funded in time, because if you look at even with organized cybercrime, they're still falling in on all these crime as a service organizations. Someone's buying boxes, registering, setting up. That's where we think there's a lot of opportunity to increase friction and just overall cost for all of them and get some people. A lot of the cyber criminals I end up running into, they could viably exist sitting in these seats if they wanted to, but they have more free time and about the same amount of money if they take the easy route. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I'm actually thinking about the whole Ella Mariachi story of credit carders back in like 2003, 2004, which is a similar kind of story.
Yeah.
But I think that the making it more difficult thing would work better on North Korea and Iran-based operations rather than like China or Russia, which have a much more structured state sponsorship.
You're probably not wrong at all there, but I still think even with what we see and what I think of the APT vein, there's still enough crossover in the criminal space. I just think generally we're not making their lives as hard as we should, right?
I agree.
You walk in the vendor booth, it's detect, detect, detect. It's like, well, how many abuse messages did you send? How much did you shut down?
We've been conditioned to not. Going back to the previous questioner, nobody responds.
I'm
or
sending abuse
rarely
now,
respond.
and when they don't respond, I'm finding their peers, I'm finding ICANN. We're starting to try to work with their internet registries. We're going to solve problems, I think, that way better than we're doing otherwise. So,
yeah.
But yeah, great question, sir.
Thanks.
Hi, there's a lot of stress test souls that are living in public GitHub repositories. Is FBI targeting them as well?
I wish I was. I don't think that's something that's high on my radar, but I'll add that. Yeah, no, we know there are.
Raising it.
Yeah, I'm failing at that part. No, I have not paid a ton of attention to that.
Yeah, they're labeled as like genuine, but
yeah.
Can be
I'll take a look. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you guys for your presentation. I was curious about the heat map and why, like, by far the #1 source of attacks was the United States, and on the polar opposite was like Russia.
Yeah.
You know? And if that's encouraging, you guys just are tracking that.
I didn't
data.
have enough time to explain. That is based on a subset of these services where I have taken the data from the actors. So those are actors mostly in North America running English services. But DDoS has predominantly been a North American, Western European crime type, okay?
Really? Okay.
Like at large, when you look at volume, there's still, and we're trying to clean that up. A lot of it is our problem. So if I look at the worldwide data set across all DDoS tools, the pictures change a little bit, but Russia's not launching as many DDoS as North America is, I don't think.
I mean, if they started, would you guys try to, or
yes,
because of the unfriendly relations?
I would love to come back another year and tell you all about our APT DDoS tracking stuff we do. That's just not this year. We didn't put that together. Great observation.
I look forward to it.
Yeah, Matt.
Thank
thanks.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
So my question goes back to the jury explaining this technicality to somebody who's not as technical. We all run into it on a day-to-day basis. What are some things that you found that does work?
Yeah, really good question, and it was really hard. I will tell you that our experts were great, although one of our experts was from Bulgaria and had a very strong Eastern European accent that was both very interesting and I think a little hard for the jury to follow. His concepts, his explanations were wonderful. It is challenging. I will say in the small group that's left that we did have a Google engineer who ended up being the foreperson on our jury. So I suspect there was some explaining going on in the jury room. That's not something I could ever replicate. And it was really challenging because we would get these objections where the experts weren't allowed to say something because it wasn't really expert testimony, and then Elliott, when he was on the stand, wasn't really allowed to say something because it was expert testimony. And there were definitely some things that didn't get explained as well as they would have liked as a result. So I think we learned a lot in the process, and we probably have experts do.
Don't dodge jury duty, because no kidding, probably because one of you is in the jury, we were okay. Like, no joke.
Not just the outcome, but the understanding.
Because of the understanding and being able to explain to other people the things we weren't allowed to.
Yeah.
Yeah, really great take.
Yeah, thanks so much. Hi. Do you find VPN usage disruptive in your investigation?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, a ton, and it'll stay disruptive. I mean, again, I wish I had 10 minutes to answer that. It's complicated. Now, I will say, when I grew up early, I was told you can't get past VPNs. Everyone has them. You can't find anyone. Well, then none of that was true. You can find a ton of people. For me, it really boils down to it as a public or private VPN, if that makes sense. Like, how much noise is in the background? If there's a lot of noise, it's challenging. And it's hard to get through, but there's very few people I haven't been able to find even when they're using VPNs, is what I would say. But really astute observation, and most government people still tell you you can't shoot past a VPN.
It's them adding friction to our systems while we're adding friction to theirs.
Yeah.
It's an arms race.
Sir.
Yeah,
can you talk about when the FBI started investigating like DDoS attacks, if we're like 20 years in, or
Oh man, great question. We have always done them, but they were usually in response to a very large attack that caused sort of outsized damage, and then somehow we attributed the source of the attack. And what was
like the Dyn attack?
Yeah, attack against Dyn or something large. So there were a few attacks in the past. What we were doing that was different is saying, well, this seems like a criminal service, but we couldn't attribute attacks to it yet. Can we investigate it as a criminal service and kind of work back to that source of attacks? That hadn't been done before. We probably should have talked about that. That just causes sort of fits to look at the problem that way at first. So I think we've ramped up a lot in the last couple of years. Like there's not a lot of viable botnets that haven't been addressed over the years, for example, but we still have a ton of work to go. So if you're interested in getting paid a lot less to do this work, we'd love to talk to you.
Okay.
We need more people.
You have fun tools.
Yeah.
None of them are money.
Yeah, great question, Josh.
Just a quick question. So you got DDoS, you get denied. So how could I solve it? So, okay, so they spoof the IP and...
Yeah.
So
the real long version, I'd love, again, I wish I had 10 minutes. Sometimes it's just done. Sometimes you get hit once and it's just a byproduct of the space you're in and you can just kind of march on. Sometimes it's deliberate. Sometimes you'll get an extortion email. Sometimes you'll have a tax hit. You might notice, I mean, you got to look at it. You might notice like they're testing your API. There's some really specific language. I always say, and I do a lot of consulting with companies that are getting hit, do you know what the attacker's motivations are? Because if you do, it can tell you a lot about where the attack is going to go. The reason I try to highlight the price differentials, most people that are mad at you have $30 to spend and not $300 to spend. Or they can work a booter out, but they can't jump to the command line that's required of the botnet. So sometimes understanding who's hitting you and with what gets you a sense of like, oh, I'm getting hit with DNS UDP reflection. Okay, well, Elliott told me peak bandwidth for that is maybe 10 gigabits per second, and our provider said that's no problem, and so we're just going to wait it out, or we're going to add a little bit of bandwidth in the interim. But if you got hit with that and they moved into some sustained layer 7 and you looked at it, like maybe you took the PCAPs, you looked at the participating IPs, and you're like, oh, Shodan says that's a botnet. I'm seeing shifting attack types. Like you might want to tell your C-suite, hey, we might have to spend some money in the short term. But if you guys are ever dealing with, I would say if DDoS is keeping you up at night, you're welcome, email me. I'd love to talk to you guys about it. Most of the time, you're getting hit incidentally, and they're going to move on.
all right, cool.
Sorry.
Thanks for all the questions.